There's a new executive position on the rise called the CRO, or the Chief Revenue Officer. The panel about to take stage will explore this new role, bridging the sales and marketing divide. Moderating is Andrew Gaffney, the editor of Demand Gen Report, a targeted e-media publication focusing on the best practices in lead nurturing and digital acquisition strategies. Joining Andrew is Cari Baldwin, CRO of Square 2 Marketing, John Donlon, Senior Research Director, SiriusDecision, and Stephen Wastie, Chief Marketing and Revenue Officer for Origami Logic. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel.
Morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Gaffney. As Christine touched on, what we've seen over the last few years, obviously marketing is playing a much more pivotal role in driving revenue, being involved in the whole revenue cycle. We saw about 3 or 4 years that 3 or 4 years ago, more companies were focused on a shared revenue cycle. So there was a lot more talk around alignment. At that point, we saw some companies that would have a VP of sales and marketing. But I think what we're seeing now more emerge is this idea or concept of a CRO. So we've got a great panel today that's going to be talking about, sharing some examples and insights about what that means to an organization and how it'll shape the future of marketing and sales. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into that. John, let me start with you. CROs, a lot of them come from sales. Yeah. Give a flavor of what you see at SiriusDecision with your clients. What are the skill sets? What are the expectations? Yeah. What's sort of some of the drivers behind the role of CROs that you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's certainly true that a lot of the CROs have bubbled up from sales. We don't see as many marketing leaders taking on the CRO responsibility, which doesn't mean it can't happen, but that just tends to be how it is these days. I think one of the biggest skills for the CRO is to have some empathy for marketing and to have a little bit of a background in marketing. One of the ways we can see that role go sideways is if now marketing is just subjugated to whatever sales wants to do. And so if you have a strong marketing leader and a CRO that has a background or sensitivity to the things that marketing has to do, then that really tends to work out well.
Yep, good point. So, Cari, given the title, it's obviously all about revenue. Are those, you're finding these roles going to just the revenue drivers, the sales machines, or are there other skill sets that you see?
Yeah, good question. I think a little bit to Bonnie's point, it's all about data, being data driven, and I think we're seeing for clients and myself spending a lot of time with the data and really understanding, what's happening in the revenue funnel and then what we can do to optimize and improve. But really, the CRO's role is to kind of combine sales, marketing, and I would add, the demand funnel and customer experience to that mix to really make sure that everybody's kind of moving in the right direction to optimize revenue. Great.
Yeah. Stephen, in your role as CRO at Origami Logic, what are some of the expectations? What were some of the asks of you when you were put into that role?
Well, I have both roles, so I'm clearly confused, which is not the first time. Yeah, I think it completely depends on the business you're in. So we actually work with B2C and B2B marketers. Typically they're large brands, but you see this kind of morass of chief revenue officers, chief growth officers, head of sales, head of marketing. Then some people are responsible for kind of performance marketing and really are sales because they're driving app downloads or whatever it is they're driving. You got people who are over here who are more about kind of land and expand and really focused on the expansion piece, and so customer success, NPS, those things come into play. And so I think it all starts with just clearly what is the business you're running and what your business model is. So that dictates, I think, the structure that's appropriate for you and the time horizons you have to think in. But then clearly the most important thing out of any of them is culture. So to John's point, there just has to be the right people in the right roles that drive the full set of accountability and expectations are set correctly from start to finish, whether you're trying to drive top of funnel or drive expansion and LTV. So it depends what you're trying to drive.
Could you start the timer just so we make sure we're staying on time there? John, going back to you. So again, from the words Chief Revenue Officer, you think more about the sales goals. You think about pipeline, closing the quarter, closing it. What else is involved in the goals for most CROs that you're talking to? Is it beyond sort of the immediate revenue, and what are some of the other implications of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, kind of come back to that point of the sensitivity for what marketing does. You know, marketing and sales can operate on slightly different rhythms. Marketing has a little bit of a longer time horizon with what they do. They're involved in the brand and reputation sorts of things, so driving awareness, perception, and preference. And that's not something that necessarily sales is lined up with. So, you know, to be effective, you've got to look at both sorts of things. Certainly there's a meeting point on pipeline, and one of the great advantages of putting the organization together under a CRO is it's not just about leads, and hey, you're giving me lousy leads, and hey, you're not following up on our leads, so it helps that alignment. But certainly pipeline and customer experience piece is really important too. So a lot of times we're seeing customer experience or customer success roll up under marketing, and so that's something that the CRO has to think about as well. Yeah.
And Cari, to your point, you taking it beyond for the immediate closing of the quarter, et cetera, what are some of the drivers behind that would make a CRO thinking more long term?
Well, what we're seeing is for clients that have CRO roles is that they are looking at more at retain and grow from a customer perspective, or equally in investing in retain and grow as net new. And so as you're onboarding a new customer, you know, really thinking beyond that initial contract value, but looking at, you know, again, lifetime value and how to really retain and expand that relationship, you know, to optimize the investment acquisition.
To Asha's point, are you seeing more marketing organizations that are getting involved with that onboarding and the thinking long term?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, onboarding and adoption, you know, because that directly affects churn, which, you know, on the reverse side of that affects, you know, long stream revenue. And, you know, the more that marketers are aligned with revenue goals, the more that everybody is focused not just on net new acquisition short-term, but long-term customer relationships. And that's where I think the shift that we're starting to see, certainly it's sales and marketing alignment, which is, I think, a byproduct of the CRO role, but everybody kind of getting around the customer. And one stat that I just read from the Customer 2020 report was that in the year 2020, customer experience will be more important to buyers than product and price. And so, you know, again, it's this alignment and really push to, you know, not only acquiring net new and working together as marketing and sales and being comped together as marketing and sales, both for net new revenue and for expansion.
John, I want to ask you, we're seeing some organizations add the CRO role, you know, officially, formally. Yeah. What is the drivers? Like, what kind of companies are adding CROs versus others that are sticking with older structures?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of different things at play. So one is we will frequently see the CRO in smaller organizations. And a lot of times you'll see it in, you know, a tech startup where the genius engineer had a great idea for a product, and now he or she is the CEO of the company. And oh yeah, there's kind of marketing and sales off to the side. You guys, yeah, just this product sells itself. We don't even need you. You know, go make T-shirts or do whatever it is that you do. And it's really product led. And so sales and marketing kind of get bucketed there. And there's a CRO. But as it's becoming more of a thing, we're seeing it in larger organizations. And it's really, we're seeing the CEOs want one throat to choke. So like you were saying, Cari, if we want one person who's worried about pre-sale, the sale, the post-sale experience, that whole thing, and our customers, creating customer retention and the lifetime value and that sort of thing. So that's where it's a little bit more of a trend. It's starting to move out of the, you know, the smaller startup world and getting into larger companies.
Good, thanks. Stephen, you touched on a lot of your companies you're working with are B2C and B2B. What's some of the nuances between them in the CRO role, and then also just in terms of the revenue funnel overall?
Yeah, I think I have a slightly different perspective on the whole CRO thing. I think there's this proliferation of chief titles and title bloat, and you know, the CRO is not the VP of sales, although in many small companies you give people a CRO title because they kind of think it sounds cool. So you get a lot of CRO titles that they're not CROs. They're driving a quarterly number for sales. That's it.
They're VP of sales,
I think
so.
Title. Yeah. So when you really think about the scope of that role, I think the consensus would be that it's much more about owning that. You know, all the time horizons, right? Whether it's the quarter, whether it's the 3-year plan, whether it's, you know, the BD work that you're doing, you know, as well as driving the quarter, it's, you know, you're kind of determining that mix between, you know, land and expand, right? You're thinking through like, what are the product dependencies, and you know, the customer success team may even roll up into you as well. And so there are a bunch of titles in, you know, previous lives, things like, you know, head of worldwide field operations and presidents, right? You used to see a lot of president titles, but really sales plus. probably marketing, maybe the go-to-market functions. So I think there's just maybe a little bit of title changing going on. I don't think necessarily it's a new role in many cases, but I think there is that notion of being accountable for the full life cycle of the customer experience. And the experience is product, it's pricing, it's everything, right? It's all those attributes that inform that overall experience and whether they buy again. If you're in a SaaS business or you're dependent on recurring revenue, you have to think like that. Otherwise, you're not going to get that renewal or that expansion piece. So when you think about net dollar retention rates and other metrics like that you really care about, you have to be thinking about like who is that one throat, if you like, to choke for the entire customer experience, not just for that first kind of sale, but the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth transaction. And so depending on how you organize underneath that, you may have the hunters and the farmers kind of stuff, but I think that's kind of antiquated as well, right? But I think where it fails is when you have a customer success team over here who's getting comped on NPS and stuff like that, and then there's a team over here that's just responsible for new business and they don't talk to each other, and there's a marketing team over here that is in their own silos that's just being measured on sourcing revenue they can attribute specifically to an event or a webinar or something. That doesn't work either. So there's a whole, data is helping us all out, right? It's giving us many, many more signals at a much, much higher velocity that we're getting better at interpreting. We're still not very good at interpreting it. But in the B2B world, we have a lot of first-party data, which is great. Like if you're a CPG company, you're a couple of steps removed from the actual end users. You don't really know your customers as well as you should do. Hence you see some Unilever buying, Dollar Shave Club, right? Get access to first-party data. We're sort of an embarrassment of riches in some cases because we have a lot of first-party data from all the CRM work that we do and everything else. So I think we're actually in pretty good shape, but there's a lot of cultural stuff that we have to implement to ensure that there's, one, that marketing is accountable for revenue, but they're also accountable for other things. And so getting that cultural alignment up front. Is everybody in marketing here? Anybody in sales? No?
Anybody marketing would give a hand raise?
So there's that continual debate you get into every quarter around, hey, what are our objectives? And hey, all the sales guys want to go to all these events because they think they're great and all the rest of it. Right. And then you do the analysis and it goes, well, we didn't really originate a lot of revenue at all out of those events, but they were great for stuff that was mid-funnel, that was in flight, like relationship influencer building. So you then have to have a conversation around, well, do you want us to originate or influence? Like, which is it? And then you get into a whole attribution discussion. And then, you choose your attribution model and no one can agree on that either. And so it just gets really hard. But I think the getting alignment up front on expectations and continuing to revisit that and using the data to support those and understanding what those signals are, those proxies for supporting those KPIs that you've agreed on, and realize the fact that they're changing all the time as people engage through new channels, and not be tied to a specific attribution model that you think was right at the beginning of the quarter. It may inform what's measurably involved in a discussion, but it's not necessarily going to give you all the answers. So a lot of it is cultural, a lot of it's process, methodology, and then there's the implementation of the tool set.
I think that culture piece is so important too. You touched on something there that you can't just expect alignment if you're going to shove people together and put them under the same organizational structure. It doesn't necessarily happen. Like you said, you can still have people operating in silos. So it's about driving alignment. A lot of that comes from inheriting what the corporate goals are, and then, okay, now what are our shared goals as a revenue organization? How are we going to work together? What does that mix look like of top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, and bottom, where we're going to put our resources to get the maximum output that we can? And that's when you start putting people together on teams, and it's not just, hey, we're all on one big team now, we're going to work together, right?
Yeah, it's organic, right? I think Bonnie mentioned it earlier. It's like just that feedback loop, like, the handoff to sales, right? All of us have been in that, is it an MQL or not? And we all go through our thrashing, and we all look to John and people for help with that. But the reality is it changes all the time. And so, making sure that teaming is happening. Like, where do the SDRs sit, right? If you have an SDR or ISR model, do they sit in marketing or do they sit in sales? That's, you kind of see both, right? But making sure that as we learn, right, from these insights that hopefully inform some kind of change or action, then we'll continue to change the model. So you may agree something up front at the beginning of the year in your planning process, or even maybe quarterly. But the reality is that may change throughout the quarter. So just making sure you have the agility, horribly overused term, but the agility and the business partnerships in the functions to be able to react to that.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question? John, are you seeing change management as being kind of a word that CROs or heads of multiple groups are really focusing on? Because, you know, you talked about process changes and you talked about aligning to the corporate goals. You know, how do you do that? I mean, how are people doing that successfully?
Yeah, it's not easy. It kind of comes along with any sort of transformational project that you have. And a lot of times what we see, there are three disciplines really that you need. You need change management, expertise, you need process management, and you need project management, because a lot of times these things are initiatives that have kind of a start and end point, and then there's a transition into the ongoing program. So, all that change management is becoming a bigger issue. It's something that CMO is thinking about. We saw, I think, the timeline of the different, Ashu was showing the different decades of the C-suite and who owns it now. And so the CMO, you know, is really coming into his or her own right now. And so there is a lot of change happening. And so that's something that you've got to be nimble or agile with. Yeah.
How many people are in marketing operations? A lot of people in marketing ops. Yeah, so I think if you're in like that kind of substrate, yeah, job security is phenomenal, because like that is. It's such a core competency, and so you know we talk to B2C companies, for example, that have pretty large analytics teams, and they're just getting bigger. There are hundreds of people in these analytics teams, because a lot of it's like what's that kind of underlying foundational? Once you've got the data, then what do you do with it? I mean, getting the data first is hard enough, but then what do you do with it? And then can you rely on it? And then how do you get it out to the people that need it? And what's the cadence for that? Is it a daily kind of optimization type thing, or is it a mixed modeling thing that may be done twice a year? But that core, before you do any of the activation stuff, like what campaigns and what channels and what content and stuff, that substrate of people, process, technology, insights is super key. And we're seeing across the board, every single company, big, large, B2B, B2C, investing in that. So you guys are really in good shape.
Cari, let me ask you, we go back to the CRO role. We talked, you mentioned that one of the skill sets is important is being able to work with data, get into insights. In the B2B world, what kind of trends are you seeing in terms of, are the metrics moving? Are they becoming more advanced? What kind of insights and metrics do CROs need or want, and where's that heading?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you think about if you're overseeing all these different groups, right? So, you've got to understand, your rep numbers and where you're seeing maximize there. You're looking at your website and how are you optimizing there? You're looking at customer acquisition costs per lead source, and how does that apply to gross margin? So there's all kinds of different data points that you're looking at, and I think that's really the critical thing, is to be able to step back and think, okay, across all these organizations, what are the 2 or 3 different data points that I'm going to be able to understand and really take and move things forward. It's a little overwhelming when you think about it. And we're a small company, but I'm looking at all these data points and really trying to figure out, what can I do to move the needle from a long-term perspective.
I think a big change we've seen across the board is, people are sort of waking up to the vanity metric bullshit.
Yeah.
And getting just a lot smarter because they have access to more data. And I think they're also being held more accountable to the business impact metrics. And so, gone are the days where the brand marketer can go out and say, yeah, we generated this many Facebook followers, or hey, impressions are great. It's like, no, not necessarily. So I think they're just getting smarter at it and just learning, frankly, and getting access to more data. So a great example of that, actually HP came out and did a bunch of public stuff on this actually recently, if you want to go check that out. But that notion of impression, just top of funnel reach, right? We're just trying to understand, how much we're getting, impressions we're getting out there. And now people are just getting a lot smarter and applying a lot more filters to that and saying, well, okay, that's great, but it's kind of meaningless. So let's look at viewability. So if you guys are familiar with kind of MRC standards for what designates an impression or a viewable impression on a display ad or a video ad, it's like 1 second, 50% of pixels. It's like, really? That's the standard. And so people using tools like Moat, if you guys are familiar with those, Oracle bought them recently, but they do a phenomenal job at viewability, right? So you layer on viewability, you apply your own viewability standard and apply that. And then you say, okay, well, maybe like half my traffic is probably bots and fraud anyway, so you use something like IAS or Double Verify or someone, which Oracle just bought as well, to say, okay, let's whack out all the stuff that's just bots and not anyone I'm interested in. And then you lay on, okay, well, what about on target, right? So actually, I'm a wine producer, and I'm running all these campaigns, and it's hitting a bunch of people that don't drink. It's like, well, that's not really helpful either. Or you're a bank, and you hit it. You launched a mortgage product, and you're you're hitting people in the wrong income group. And so people are just getting better at interpreting or using the data, identifying what data they need to inform an action, and saying, it's not just about impressions, to be viewable impressions, that are on target for my particular segment I'm trying to hit with that campaign, right? And you'll come up with much smaller numbers, but much, much more insightful in terms of what you can then do with it.
John, in a B2B world, in a revenue funnel kind of world, is it going beyond sort of conversion rates and MQLs? I mean, obviously you guys invented the demand waterfall, and that's evolving. I mean, where are you seeing metrics heading for CROs and B2B organizations?
Yeah, there's a few things. First of all, it's challenging. So now you're in the CRO role, and you used to, again, we're using the stereotype of somebody who came up from sales, but you're used to just worrying about sales metrics, and now you've got all this data available to you, what's going on in marketing, potentially customer success, and it can be overwhelming. The good news is that for the people that perform well in that role, they take a step back and they say, all right, well, what information do I need to run my business? And they don't get caught up in low-level metrics and unique website visitors and that sort of thing. They stop and ask just the plain question, what information do I need? And then they can start to go out and get it. So we're certainly seeing metrics move just beyond demand. And again, marketing does more than just demand. And one of the interesting things, too, is that we're seeing with the technology that's available today, it's a little bit easier to start to put together that secret sauce recipe. So what were the interactions that different people in the buying group, and there's more than one person typically in the B2B world, that has interactions with us, what were those tactics and assets that they consumed, and when did they consume them in the buyer's journey and in their customer life cycle? So now, there is, Bonnie's right, in B2B we don't have as much data, but there is some bigger data sets that we have available to us, and so we can start to crunch that. And so that's sort of touch analysis or attribution work is what we're seeing a lot of.
Okay.
And one thing to add to that, we're really being more strategic as we're thinking about our ICP, right?
Yeah.
And taking the kind of data that you're talking about, John, and really, looking at, the customer lifetime value, the acquisition costs, the burden on support, and, you've got the one person that doesn't go on online banking, they call every Friday to say, how much money do I have in my account? Those are costing us money. We want to get rid of those guys. But really being more strategic about, who is the ideal customer profile and how do we all align against going after those people and kind of letting the others, maybe move by the wayside a little bit because we have more insight and knowledge into how we're going to move the cheese, with the right types of companies.
Yeah.
Cari, you touched on alignment earlier. I mean, it seems like it's an age-old kind of debate and conversation, but with the CRO role emerging, with more progress in shared funnels, are you seeing real traction in alignment? Is it less of an issue than it used to be?
Yeah, I think it's, I think a lot of it is generational, truthfully. I mean, it seems like maybe more of there was a term that somebody was using yesterday, and I was like, I didn't want to be in the legacy category because, I'm not 20.
It's like close to the scrap heap pile.
Yeah, you could be Cari Classic.
Thank you, I like that, I like that. But more of the legacy leaders, were the ones that maybe were less innovative in really kind of pushing the organization to be collaborative. So I think, as we move through that, it seems to be more in the DNA of both marketing and sales. They get it, and as they're moving up the ranks, I think it's kind of a natural evolution of alignment. We see it more times than not because you're kind of a jerk if you're not, if you're not on board with, working with your sales and marketing colleagues. So
that term applies to anybody. Any age can be a jerk.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And I do think it's a top-down thing too, right? And the CEO has to make sure that everybody understands it's a priority, and there'll be ramifications if not.
John, are there better shared metrics and better shared goals of success that you're seeing?
Yeah, so one thing I was going to say, in addition to that, is it's not just a good idea or a feel-good idea. We did a big study a couple of years ago that showed that if you have alignment between sales, marketing, and product, you're going to see 19% higher growth in the top line and 15% higher growth in net profit. So there's real ROI there. I think probably the easiest shared metric between sales and marketing, whether they're under a CRO or not, is pipeline. So, we're starting to see a lot more organizations get away from that squabbling around the leads and say, all right, let's give marketing a little bit more skin in the game. So they're going to sign up for a pipeline number, whether that's sourced pipeline or influenced or maybe both. They're not really responsible for what happens at the very end of the waterfall, so we're not going to go there to revenue always. Sometimes we do see source and influence revenue, but more pipeline is where they meet in the middle, at least in terms of where sales and marketing come together.
Stephen, share a little about what you're doing in your organization, if you would, to have a shared vision and.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy for me because it kind of comes to me. So we're a small company. So I think it comes down to accountability and making sure everybody's operating against the same set of metrics, whether that's a revenue number and then the key kind of indicators that would inform that. And then the further you get down in terms of the activity metrics and so forth. But that hierarchy of metrics, I think, is super key. But to John's point, like starting off at the top with what it is you're trying to achieve, what answer, even in marketing, right? What answer are you trying to drive towards? What question have you got? Like if you're creating a dashboard, for example, like they just show me a bunch of metrics. Like what answer am I trying to get from this data? And like, what's the insight, right? Don't just give me the data. So I think we've done a lot of kind of closed loop stuff in terms of making sure we have very specific definitions around stages and handoffs, and we have sort of stand-ups, if you like, every day, and we go through pipeline, and so that communication is really, really high. Expectation setting up front is really high, or sort of very clear between the teams. Product are involved in a lot of stuff. The customer success implementation team are involved in a lot of stuff. Like the shorter time we can reduce, in terms of take the friction out of deployment. That means you can start having a better conversation about expansion quicker and all that kind of stuff. So it's easy to do it in a small company, although some small companies screw it up as well. It's hard to do that at scale. It's like, so the great example I use would be like every company has their like just killer sales rep. That one person or two people that just kill it every quarter, and they do it kind of behind the scenes. They're not the ones that are giving marketing a hard time for lack of leads, right? It's never that person. But I think we learn a lot from those people, because what those people are like CROs of their territory, right? What those people are doing is they're managing their time horizons, right? They're managing their short-term funnel and medium and long-term funnel. They're expanding into their base. They're expanding into people they've sold to in other companies, right? They're running their own kind of local networking events. They're reaching out. They're doing a lot of social selling, right? They're doing a lot of pipeline building and territory, if you like, development on their own, in the same way that we have to think about that at scale. It's just really hard to do it at scale.
Yeah.
I think most of the audience, pretty high percentage, were either in marketing or marketing ops. So, Cari, if you're sitting in that role, and let's say you're in an organization that just brought on a CRO, or maybe in 6 months from now brings on a CRO, and in most cases they come from sales, that can be kind of bad news. It can be scary. Now you're reporting into somebody that sort of doesn't get marketing's disciplines, I guess, if you will. What would you recommend to people in the audience that are maybe having to, at some point, report up into a CRO? What can they do? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think I always recommend, get to know your sales colleagues. Spend time with your, you hear more of the title of revenue operations. So it's, I think even at that very tactical level where companies are starting to combine marketing ops and sales ops, which, I think it kind of makes sense because, again, there is a strategic handoff at that point. But, get to know your sales colleagues. And I think we're all going to be in a better position if we're sitting in on sales calls. If we're the marketing ops person, we still need to understand the customer and the sales process and, kind of the things that our sales colleagues are hearing. And so, that would be my advice to all marketers, but, marketing ops included. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Sometimes it comes down to something as simple as go to lunch with them, Go hang out with them a little bit, get to know them on a personal basis. And I think sales and marketing, is kind of sort of a Venn diagram there. There's a lot of overlap. There are distinct things that they'll always do. And the same thing is true at the operations level. I was just actually, before we got started here, I was catching up with an old friend and colleague, Ruben Varela, who's here in the audience, and he is now head of revenue ops. And so we're talking a little bit about what that looks like and how that works. And we've done a little bit of research on it at Sirius, and there's, whether they're together under the same umbrella or whether they're separate and they just need to work together, there are 4 areas that are important to connect on. One is planning. The second is lead management or demand management, however you want to think about that, measurement, and then data. So those are the 4 key areas where you need to have alignment. Again, whether you're all one big happy family or you just need to kind of stay in lockstep with each other.
Great. Stephen, anything you'd share there in terms of marketing, working with the CRO?
Yeah, I mean, they shouldn't be in conflict, right? We're all trying to drive revenue and shareholder value or whatever your value metric is. So they should never be in conflict. The path to get there is a debate sometimes. the debate as a marketing, I've had many marketing roles, and the debate is sometimes like, what's the emphasis, right? There's clearly a amount of time, energy, resources you put on driving pipeline, but there's other stuff you have to do that may not be the immediate care about for the head of sales, the CRO, whatever. So you just have to agreement on that up front, and then also agree to what the strategy is. And so is it expansion we're trying to drive and lifetime value from existing base? Or are we going to try and drive new logos? Well, which is it? As long as you get agreement up front and continue to revisit that, I think you have a phenomenal partnership. Like, I've been in a couple of companies where I've worked for sales a couple of times, or president, and it's worked phenomenally well. You just agree up front and you have shared goals. Like, we ran a big user conference and we gave quotas to the sales guys and to the marketing teams on getting people there, right? And we had one campaign we ran for okay, we're going to run a campaign for getting CIO meetings, right? That was a campaign that we ran throughout the quarter, and we took half of it, the sales reps took half of them. And so you have this kind of shared responsibility, but they shouldn't be in conflict, right? Maybe the time horizon is different, but that's the difference between a VP of sales and a CRO, I think, is like they're thinking about next year, not the quarter. And then you get to a certain scale, you get beyond sort of the first couple of reps and you're into growth and then you're into expansion. You're really thinking about a capacity model at that point. You're not thinking about deals. And that changes the whole mindset.
As we close out, not looking just specifically at CROs, but the revenue funnel in general, each of you, 30 seconds on a big trend that you'd recommend people be looking at or thinking about. John, I think you'd kick that off with.
Yeah, well, I'll have a shameless plug here for the new demand unit waterfall that Sirius just released. But really,
set you up for that one.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. I'll pay you later at the bar. No, but really, it's we re-architected that to reflect what we're seeing in the market now and where it's going. And essentially, I'll boil it down for you. It's a matter of thinking about opportunities at the top of the waterfall. So there's a buying team that gets together. There's a number of people that are there. It's not these onesie-twosie leads that at some point when we have to do this mechanical transition from a lead to an opportunity, we need to kind of reconcile all that. It's thinking in terms of the potential deal almost at the top of the waterfall and then flowing it down from there. And there's some great vendors out there that help with that and are already thinking that way. A lot of organizations that are thinking that way. So the technology's got a little bit of a ways to catch up to that, and there's some other challenges, but that's a big trend. It's kind of moving away from this idea of leads and more the demand unit or the potential deal.
Cari, anything quick?
I would echo what John said, but I get asked often, kind of what's the technology roadmap, and I always say, what's the business problem that you're trying to solve? And I think, we all have to be, I love technology and I love chasing it, but, we all have to be smart and kind of systematic in how we roll things out. But, I do think that attribution and funnel metrics is, after CRM, after marketing automation, to me, that's number 3, hands down, maybe data, tied with that. But, so I think there's a trend to kind of digest so much technology, and you got to buy the new latest and greatest, and I would kind of buck that and say, step back, stop drinking from the fire hose, and acquire it, learn it, own it, understand it, optimize it, and then go get the next piece.
Great. Final thought?
Final thought would be CAC to LTV. Focus on that metric, and that will focus you at the top end in terms of driving efficiency, but also the most important, I think, in my mind is the customer experience, which you mentioned, which is, look, if customers are happy, they're going to buy more. If they're not, they're going to suck the lifeblood out of you. So that customer success team is your best sales team, right, when you think about LTV. But then you've got to balance that with top of funnel. So CAC to LTV is a good focus area.
Great. I want to thank the panel for great insights. John's going to be doing a keynote after lunch that you can check out, and Cari's speaking as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.